Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Dr. Anastasia Kārkliņa Gabriel, author of Cultural Intelligence for Marketers. Anastasia, what a pleasure to see you. I'm really excited to talk about cultural intelligence for marketers. So welcome to the show.
Likewise, thrilled to be here, and thanks for your time.
Oh yeah, great. Well, look, it's a fascinating topic, and I know that we'll delve into it quite a bit. But let's just begin with some definitions so that we get the bigger picture and people understand a little bit more about your book. So just talk about some general things like how do you define cultural intelligence and how do you develop it, or why is it important to business?
That would be my pleasure. I am very specific with my definitions in the book, and so I'm glad you asked that question. And that's where we're beginning, partially because I think we need common language to know that we're moving in the same direction, we're talking about the same things. So I define cultural intelligence as an ongoing practice, primarily of tracking and analyzing trends, movements, social forces, and culture, and then really taking the time to understand their cultural implications as well as their commercial implications, and using that knowledge to drive not only commercial advantage, but also a positive impact on culture. And the reason I get very specific about how I define it is because when I was doing research for this book, I realized that cultural intelligence is something that marketers have adopted as a term, especially in the last year or two. But as I read more and more thought leadership, that didn't seem to be an agreed upon definition of what it is that we are talking about. And I may have read some literature that said cultural intelligence about speaking across markets, adapting marketing from the US market to the market in Japan, etc. Others have defined it as just being understanding of cultural differences. Still yet, I found that some thought leadership out there didn't define it at all, and we just kind of were to presume that we know what we're talking about. So that felt very important at the onset of the book to set the stage, to define it in a very precise way. And I should say, moving away from where the term originates, which is in cross-management studies, so questions of managing diverse teams, etc., and to make the definition specific to marketers' day-to-day responsibilities and what we are tasked with as custodians of the brands that we manage or clients we serve.
Oh, no, I think you've said that very well. And I think one of the things that happens in marketing and probably in all industries is a word or a phrase becomes so charged. Maybe not always emotionally charged, but it either becomes overused or sometimes misrepresented. And words become important. And when we were chatting before, I mentioned I was in a session yesterday about brand purpose, and I know that we'll allude to that later. But it's funny how not only definitions change, but how sometimes words wear out and they no longer represent what's necessary. So that was really terrific. Let me just ask you something else, and then we'll get into some of the specifics. But your book focuses on how brands reflect culture and actively shape societal norms and values. Just talk a little bit about that, because I think that'll be nice intro for some of the specifics.
That is the premise of the book and the work that I feel passionate doing in my day-to-day work life. And that is this idea that brands are not only commercial entities that are out in the marketplace to drive revenue and market products to consumers who need them, but brands are also cultural agents. And I invite marketers to start thinking about marketing as a form of mass media that is very much like popular culture, entertainment, and so on. And that is certainly true in the kind of digital landscape that we navigate and we inhabit, where brands are aiming to be part of culture and consumers' media consumption. And so that seems very important, not only from the perspective of kind of high-level cultural theory, but from a perspective of what, as marketers, we're tasked with in this moment. And I think it's important to pinpoint that we are no longer in, the marketplace of the 70s or 80s when marketers would incite, and make products appealing to audiences by incentivizing them to buy. We are in a very different landscape where, especially the younger generation, scrutinize brands, are very distrustful, specifically of big brands and brand-driven businesses, and have their critical eye on brands at all times. So we are no longer have the luxury of putting creative out into the marketplace and hoping that it incentivizes audience to buy. We have to be very strategic and critically minded about the kind of messages that we put out and how they will be ultimately received, whether by target audiences or by the broader civic society that is very much engaged in this landscape of mass media, of which marketing, I argue, is a part.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And certainly one of the reasons why I got into marketing and advertising decades ago was because I was intrigued by let's call it, contemporary culture. Now, but like everything else, it evolves. Um, Let me just bring up something. You raised a lot of very interesting things, some of it being generational, some of it being distrust of brands. And I think those, I hope we get more into that. I just wanted to segue into something because I found it so interesting. Um, the forward of your book is quite provocative, as it was written by Dr. Marcus Collins, who was the former head of strategy at Wieden and Kennedy. And I found it fascinating that he talks about Queen Elizabeth I, consumption as a means of power, and the golden age of England, and then finally makes the analogy, and I'll quote, the brands we consume today have less to do with what they are and more to do with who we are. So, what was so important about that statement for you?
It was important just to have Dr. Collins's insight in setting the stage for this book, and I think Forward speaks to that deep level of insight that I think as marketers we should aspire to embrace and emulate. And what seems specifically meaningful about that particular statement and the argument he makes is that it reflects the broader argument of the book, and that is that marketers must start thinking through the lens of meaning making as we enter the marketplace and think about the role that brands play. What do I mean by that? Well, in a very simple terms, that means that I'm not an athlete. I'm not really a runner. I hate running, but I go and buy Nike because it makes me feel something. And it makes me feel that I could be an athlete, that I could be audacious, that I could reach my goals, that I could push myself to the limits. I don't know anything about the structure of sneakers or whether Nike is better than Adidas or Puma or whatever other brand produces sneakers, but I'm there because wearing that brand signals something to myself and signals something to others about who I am. And being familiar with Dr. Collins's work, I think that hopefully I'm not misrepresenting his argument, but I think that's the essence of what he's really trying to convey. And it really relates to some of the parts of the book where I invite marketers to start thinking how these messages, these units of meaning are transported into culture. Why is that important? Well, we know that at this point, a lot of marketing leaders are very anxious about causing backlash, about how their messages will be received. They might be very interested in being purpose-driven or at least actively inclusive, but they're reasonably worried. And so what Dr. Collins's work and my own alludes to is that once we understand brands as these units of meaning, as vessels of meaning, and perhaps more appropriately marketing assets as units of those meaning going out into the world, we can start asking these questions. Well, what does that mean to audiences? How will it be received? And most importantly, what kind of unintended messaging that this particular marketing campaign, asset, or messaging might cause that I'm not anticipating? To me, that is just so important to produce genuinely inclusive marketing and marketing that is culturally intelligent, that anticipates those meanings and thinks about brands in those terms, which I think are just very important for our professional responsibilities.
No, you said it right, and I think responsibility is a very important word. And like everything you say, there's a lot of different issues in here, and I'm hoping we can unpack more of them. Let me just let's go to something that I think continues to set the tone here. You begin cultural intelligence for marketers by redefining brand success and discussing what's not working. I think those examples now, if you don't mind sharing them, would be helpful to continuing to paint this picture. And I actually love the way that you're using words in a very different way to make things much clearer.
Hmm. I found it very imperative to just start with diagnosing where we are. And it's hard to talk about cultural intelligence, inclusive marketing, purpose in branding and marketing without talking about 2020 and the kind of conversation that was incited just 4 years ago. And in order to do good work, I think, I'm an academic by training. I do think we have to diagnose issues and really take stock of where we are. To your earlier point of how buzzwords can take meaning of their own, can lose their actual essence. And so I think it's important to recognize how marketing is also being affected by the broader cultural landscape, social landscape. That's precisely why the social forces, cultural movements are part of how I understand cultural intelligence. To say that we are seeing kind of regression in attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're seeing kind of skepticism around purpose. Some of it I think is very well earned. And so I start with outlining ways such as performative gestures, casting models that signal diversity into campaigns, signaling messaging that is really trying hard to appear inclusive without really truly understanding the lived experience of those audiences, and in other ways tries to project an image of inclusivity that we know from research, from cultural discourse, audiences are very quick to pick up on. So the point, I guess, I want to make is that in order for us to level up and to produce marketing that is truly culturally incisive, we have to be honest about where we are and what's not working. And I always say, old ways of thinking cannot solve enduring problems. We need new ideas and new frameworks to really push us forward.
Interesting, interesting. Talk specifically now about the 4 C's that you mentioned in the book as tools for advanced cultural insights.
I love that question. And it makes me think, based on what I just said, that the next question is usually, okay, like, what do we do? And how do we move forward? What is the secret formula? And I created this framework of 4 C's that initially in my mind was a 4-step framework. But as I wrote the book, I realized that this work is messy. This work is complicated precisely because culture is always evolving and we are in this landscape of culture is always moving. So at the very least, we need some pillars that marketers can take and rest upon and draw upon and get inspired by to apply them to whatever part of marketing process they're in, whether that's research or creative and going to market. So I define the 4 C's of cultural intelligence as culture, communication, critical consciousness, and community. And those 4 C's speak to different aspects of the marketing process, from understanding culture and looking for the next opportunity that is both commercially advantageous, but also culturally relevant. Communication, which really helps marketers understand how those units of meaning travel into culture and how can we anticipate how our communication is going to be received. Essentially, how can we prevent preventable mistakes? And then critical consciousness really drills into the idea of making our marketing inclusive and not just when it comes to purpose-driven marketing, but having that lens at the forefront of anything that we do and put into the culture. And lastly, community, which is how do we move into more of co-creation? How do we tackle consumer skepticism around brands, specifically when there is a certain level of influencer fatigue and distrust, as we mentioned before.
No, that's pretty comprehensive. It's also in some ways a bit daunting, and I know you did them as pillars to make it seem a little bit easier in this messy world in which we live. And I think we're finding that there's so much on the plates of marketers today that it becomes overwhelming. It absolutely becomes overwhelming. There's always something new layered on, and whether it's new technology, new ways of approach, new incidents in the world. I mean, it becomes quite challenging. So within that, against that backdrop, how would you recommend a marketer start to identify the right cultural narrative for a brand?
I always like to make it very tangible, which I resonate with your point about being overwhelming. And I like to bring in the example of Billy, which is a brand that is mentioned in the book. And I had a chance to get some info from the founder of Billy, who was one of those founders and brand makers from scratch that created this brand that really identified cultural opportunity that was aligned with their vertical, with their category, and with their product. And I think the overwhelm always often stems from this idea that, a funny example that I like to mention, a mayonnaise is supposed to go and save the world, from food waste or whatnot. Or, there's a lot of kind of cynicism that we have around making brands heroes and, social issues that are not necessarily relevant to what the brand stands for or the product. And I think Billy is such a good example to make it very tangible to say, well, there was a brand that, for those who don't know, is direct-to-consumer business that is offering shaving products. And they made a mark on the industry and became widely successful because they were one of the first to realize women who were buying shaving products have never seen other women on the screen shave actual legs. For so many years, we had products that were showing models shaving already shaved legs. And they realized that we were on the cusp of body positivity movement, and female consumers particularly were yearning for more authentic representations of their experience, for brands to really see them and allow them to have armpit hair and be on screen shaving their legs just the way that they are in their everyday life. And so they saw how that particular deeper consumer need aligned with their product. And so they were the first to go to market with communications that showed women just as we are when we are in our bathroom, hairy, which was pretty scandalous. And that example is brilliant because now a lot of brands are trying to emulate Billy, among others, to kind of project that message of inclusivity and body positivity. So why does this example matter? I think the first step to finding cultural opportunity is understanding the deeper need of consumers that have been historically overlooked. They don't necessarily need to be marginalized groups of people, but women audiences, for example, were completely represented in unrealistic ways. And really asking what is missing, what have we overlooked, how would we find a window of opportunity that is both culturally relevant, speaks to that need, but also is going to speak to our product and the kind of services that we offer.
Just as a quick aside, do you think it's easier for a new brand that has a real founder story than it is for an established brand?
Oh, absolutely. I think we are seeing, as I mentioned, this landscape that is media saturated, where a lot of brands are on social media producing content, and we see that what audiences yearn is a real story. When we see what the kind of content that goes viral, it usually has some kind of story about individual who decided to create something, right? And this goes viral. People are drawn to it. They resonated. They want to support others, and audiences, especially younger ones, are specifically resonating with people who are not pretentious, people who are just, passionate about something. I think we see that in the kind of content that is popular among audiences all the time, and brands are trying to tap into that conversation, be part of it. And so hence why we see a lot of established brands tapping into humor, being entertaining, being relatable. And so, of course, I do think that brands that are smaller businesses that have a more unique story of creating something from scratch have an advantage. But I also think that's kind of a wonderful thing, because as a marketer, I feel like small business owners are often left behind in our conversations, and we're focused on the Nikes and the Patagonias, and I'm quite passionate about speaking to anybody who is managing a brand today, because all of us are facing different, but in some ways rather similar challenges in this climate.
Yeah, and I think the issue is to try to get it right for that individual. You can use as many examples as you like to bring things to life, but I think that they're meant to spark the idea for the innovation for that individual brand, so it goes about in its own way. Um, you also talk about brand accountability. Now, accountability again is another one of those words that has been coming into marketing more and more and more. What does it mean in the context of cultural intelligence, though?
It starts with an understanding that I think we all should have, that, as I mentioned before, brands are not just commercial entities out in the world. Brands are cultural agents. And I spent quite a bit of time in the book inviting marketers to think about how an average consumer does not think about brands in the way that we as marketers think. And I say that as somebody who pivoted into marketing after spending a decade in academia and a lot of activist spaces. And so I was one of those people who scrutinized the brands, who was calling out Axe and Victoria's Secret when they were producing rather, to be honest, sexist representation of women. And I've been part of the grassroots conversations about how brands can do better. And I'm kind of in between the two worlds, because every time I post something about a brand doing good or marketers really trying to create an inclusive campaign, I always get the skepticism from the other side of my network, which is outside of business. So to your point about brand accountability, I think that's a starting point for marketers, that consumers think of brands as part of corporations' businesses, and there's a heightened awareness like never before that brands are there to make money and make profits. And I think that's just what we're dealing with since 2020, when there was a larger conversation about social impact, environmental impact. And every time a brand goes to market with a campaign, I always emphasize the importance of really thinking about accountability and impact. And a lot of times that will mean that brands will be expected not to just talk the talk, but walk the talk. And frequently the expectation will be that brand will contribute in some kind of financial way or tangible material way to the communities that they speak to and from which they draw cultural ideas, artifacts, etc., that they use in marketing.
It's interesting that you say that, and I'd like to segue a bit to talking a little bit about purpose, because you mentioned doing good. It's funny, the things that you say are dovetailing. I mentioned that I had presented some research that the Internationalist had done on purpose, and we've been doing it since 2016, and we were really surprised by the results this year, because 72% of marketers surveyed felt that there was a real disconnect between brand values and the actions that they take. Now, that's among marketers. I mean, that's an extraordinary number. And we even had very high numbers in some other areas, like you know, concerns about how they communicate and what that would mean to backlash, or purpose washing, however you want to talk about it. So I'm curious as to how then you integrate your work on cultural intelligence with notions of purpose?
Well, first, I'm so glad you said that you've been involved in this work well before 2020. That's one of the narratives I try to deconstruct and push back upon, because I am in a lot of marketing circles where it seems to, just focus on recent years, but there are people who have been doing this for a very long time. And even in the book, just as a side note, I go and talk to one of the marketing scholars who studied essentially purpose in 1969. So, this has been an ongoing long conversation. And I, in my work, like to tease out purpose and inclusive, culturally intelligent marketing. I think there is a sort of a disconnect between how we are seeing backlash against purpose driven marketing. And I want to, I guess, separate the backlash from the earned skepticism in some circles, from just general inclusivity and cultural representation in marketing more broadly. My argument is that regardless of whether a brand is purpose driven or not, and whether social purpose makes sense for that particular brand and for that particular brand's positioning, culturally intelligent marketing matters to any brand. And I like to mention example of something like mayonnaise or any household product. We only have to look at the marketing assets of the 70s and 80s to see how marketing reflected a lot of sexist portrayals of women of that time. And we would be mistaken not to think that it didn't have anything to do with the social norms and cultural values of that time. So while I generally believe that social impact is important for any brand because brands are cultural agents, I also empathize with marketers who don't necessarily see purpose as part of their brand positioning from a strategic perspective. And I like to emphasize, well, inclusivity, equity, representation, those things are still part of the equation, and we are not excused from attending to them in our day-to-day life.
No, well, very well said. You also mentioned how your work helps brands ignite cultural innovation, but also leverage the power of media for good. Now, we haven't talked about media, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, perfect timing, because I just alluded to that in my mention of, for example, food or household products and marketing that we have seen over the years. I argue, as I mentioned, that marketing should be seen as a form of mass media that is influencing not only, that is influencing not only consumers in the kind of buying and purchasing decisions that are going to make, but is influencing society at large with the kind of representation that people are seeing of themselves and others in the media that they consume. And to that point, I would love for more brands to be accountable for the impact that they have in society in their respective category. But even before we get there, marketers need to understand the social responsibility that we have to produce representation that is representative of people of society and also inclusive. And I always like to mention that we can't think of ourselves as different from marketers who are producing the kind of advertising that we now can look back on and say, well, that was really sexist, or that was not really inclusive. But that's not us. We are also, as marketers, implicated in what we know to be true, what is been made normal to us. And that's why I devote a quite large chunk of the book to questioning our own assumptions, and how, as marketers, we would be well served to ask, how is my worldview shaping the marketing that I put out in the world? Am I missing something? Am I assuming certain things about my audience is just because I'm not from that community, or I don't have the same lived experience? So in terms of doing good, again, I think it extends far beyond purpose or social impact that brands make on specific cultural, social issues, to responsibility to produce representative and responsible media from the get-go.
or just responsibility, period, in many ways. Something responsibility writ large. If cultural change is continuous, then how does a brand stay relevant? I mean, do you constantly have to be doing this work?
And that's precisely why I define cultural intelligence as an ongoing practice of tracking these signals, trends, movements. It is a mistake, in my view, to chase trends that we often mistake for drivers of consumer behavior. Certainly, one might find a trend on social media and be able to plug into that conversation at the right time in the way that is relevant to the brand and find success. But my concern is that marketers might be tempted and are tempted, in my experience in my conversations, to see those trends as what marketers should jump on. But as you said, culture is ever moving, it's fast paced, and yet there's also this part of culture that is another layer that is slower moving, that is actually driving consumer expectations at a slightly slower scale. It's not the scale of the TikTok trend, on the Instagram trend. There are certain human needs that are being shaped. For example, body positivity is one good example of that. It takes time to develop and be pushed from the margins to the mainstream. So how do marketers stay on top of that? By developing this practice of tracing signals, paying attention to culture, and taking note of what's going on outside of world of business. I think that's a very important point to me, largely because when we are fearful of backlash, we might want to stay away from certain issues. And it's not to say that we have to engage those issues in our work, but as marketers, we have to stay informed of what's happening environmentally, socially, culturally, politically, to be able to understand where the culture is headed and what should we prepare for.
No, that and no wonder they feel overwhelmed most of the time. But I do think you make a fascinating point in differentiating, short-term trends with longer term cultural movement. I think that's quite insightful. So, okay, on a final note, although I have a feeling that we could probably talk about this for several more hours, um, what would you say is the most important thing for a marketer to consider when regarding cultural intelligence? Just distill it down to what is the one thing they should really focus on.
I would invite marketers to focus on self-reflection and self-awareness. It can get overwhelming to think about all the things we need to track and analyze and tap into. But at the end of the day, any brand-driven business that wants to put out culturally resonant, inclusive marketing, it has to start with people on the team and fostering a culture of questioning when it is not only okay and normal, but actively encouraged to ask questions. Are we missing something here? Well, have we considered that from multiple perspectives? I know our primary audience is this group. Are there some people in this audience that have different experience in our category, the product? How can we really be expansive and question our own assumptions, our own blind spots, in how we do research, casting, recruitment for our research studies, market research studies, etc. So it starts with the self. And I always say that it is often that we talk about brands as these entities floating in the ether, and we talk about, big brands, etc. But at the end of the day, we are behind those brands. They're ordinary people making decisions, and it is our responsibility to interrogate our own set of biases, assumptions that we all have, and start there, I think.
Yeah, no, and I also think if you're very dedicated to a brand and you've done a lot of work with it, you sometimes do wear blinders because, you don't want to see other competition. You believe what you're doing is right, and that's hard. That's hard for anything. Well, you have opened up so many wonderful insights, and I wish you nothing but success with cultural intelligence for marketers. You have not only studied it well, your background is extraordinary for this in terms of your early years. And also your passion, not only for this, but your passion for marketing comes through too. So what a pleasure to talk to you. And I hope that our conversations continue.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate your attention to my thinking the book and your time. It's just been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
A pleasure as well. Take care. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.